The Winchester's roar shattered the desert silence, the sound ricocheting off canyon walls like the wrath of God himself. Frank Callahan's eyes widened in shock, that split second of recognition when a man realizes his time has run out. Before the .45 caliber slug found its mark, his body crumpled, dust billowing where he fell. "This land has rules of its own," Mason Reed declared, his voice rough as gravel underfoot, the Colt Army revolver in his weathered hand still smoking. "That's why I'm still standing, and you're in the dirt." 20 yards beyond Callahan's body, a young woman remained tied to a wooden post, her blue dress singed at the edges, dark hair framing a face that refused to show fear. Her eyes met Mason's across the distance, not with gratitude, but with something harder: recognition. The torch that had threatened her life now smoldered uselessly in the dust beside her tormentor. Mason Reed hadn't planned on killing anyone today. At 45, the former Texas Ranger and Civil War veteran had sworn off violence 5 years ago after burying his wife Sarah beneath a cottonwood tree on this very property. Her fever had broken him in ways no battle ever could. His cattle ranch in the Texas borderlands was supposed to be his refuge. But in 1875, the border country made its own rules, and peace was a luxury few men could afford. He holstered his weapon, the familiar weight of the gun against his hip, a reminder of a past he couldn't seem to escape. As he approached the woman, his hand instinctively checked the knife in his boot. Another habit from days he'd rather forget. The Texas sun had tanned his skin like saddle leather, and gray flecked his once dark beard. Deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of hard miles and harder decisions. This wasn't the first time Mason Reed had killed a man, but he'd promised himself it would be the last. 3 hours earlier, Mason had been mending fence posts along the western edge of his property. The rhythmic pounding of his hammer had become almost meditative over the years, honest work that let a man's thoughts wander while his hands stayed busy. He'd just driven a nail home when the scream ripped through the morning stillness. Raw and desperate, it carried words that turned his blood cold. "Someone help! They're burning me alive!" The hammer fell from Mason's hand, thudding against the hard-packed earth as he grabbed his Winchester from where it leaned against a nearby post. The rifle's worn stock fit his grip like it belonged there. "Damn it all," he muttered, knowing trouble had found him again. 5 years of laying low, of staying out of other people's business, and now this. Mason's boots dug into the rocky terrain as he moved toward the sound, his mind calculating faster than his feet could carry him. The scream had come from Willow Creek, a half-mile east where his property bordered disputed territory. Every instinct, honed from years tracking Comanche raiders and Mexican bandits, told him he was walking into something that couldn't be ignored. When he crested the ridge overlooking the creek, what he saw made his jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. 3 men on horseback circled a young woman like wolves around wounded prey. Even from this distance, Mason recognized the lead rider, Frank Callahan, with his distinctive red bandana and silver-trimmed saddle. The sight of him made Mason's trigger finger itch. 7 years earlier, Mason had led the Ranger operation that broke up Callahan's human trafficking ring along the border. 16 women and children destined for brothels in Mexico had been freed. Mason had put a bullet in Callahan's shoulder that day, but the governor's crooked nephew had arranged his release before he could stand trial. The wound had left Callahan with a permanent stoop to his right side, a deformity that had earned him the nickname the Vulture among locals. Below, pressed against a fallen cottonwood, the young woman stood with her chin raised defiantly despite her bound hands. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and even from this distance, Mason could see the burns already marking her skin. "Please," her voice carried up to him, steady despite everything. "I have every right to be on this land." Callahan's laugh was cold enough to freeze blood. "Rights?" He spat on the ground near her feet. "Your kind don't have rights here." He raised a flaming torch. "Last chance to tell us where your father hid the money, Breed. or we'll see if you burn as easy as he did. Through his rifle scope, Mason studied the woman. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, native and Spanish most likely. Her dress was already singed at the edges, and Mason realized with sickening clarity they hadn't just been threatening to burn her, they'd already started. What caught his eye, however, was something pinned to the front of her dress, a medal. Not just any medal, but a Congressional Medal of Honor. Mason had seen enough of them during the war to recognize it instantly. The woman's gaze suddenly lifted, scanning the ridge as if sensing his presence. For just a moment, their eyes locked across the distance, and Mason saw something that hit him like a physical blow. Not fear, not desperation, but fierce, unwavering determination. Without hesitation, Mason steadied his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, just as he'd been trained. His finger found the trigger's sweet spot. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder as the bullet struck the torch from Callahan's hand, exploding it into a shower of sparks and flames. "What the hell?" Callahan's startled horse reared up, nearly unseating him as the other men scattered for cover. Mason chambered another round, the satisfying metallic click audible even over the chaos below. "That shot came from the ridge," one of Callahan's men shouted, pointing toward Mason's position. In the confusion that followed, shouting men, rearing horses, clouds of dust, Mason made his way down the rocky slope, his Winchester held ready. The woman had taken advantage of the chaos to duck behind a cluster of boulders near the creek bed. "Reed!" Callahan's voice rose above the commotion as he recognized the figure approaching through the dust. "Mason goddamn Reed!" Mason stood tall, making himself visible. "Been a long time, Frank. Shoulder still giving you trouble?" His voice remained level, but his eyes tracked every movement of Callahan's men. Callahan's face contorted with rage as he nursed his burned hand against his chest. "This isn't your business, Reed. The woman's a thief and a trespasser." "Funny," Mason replied. "I heard different." He kept his rifle raised slightly, not aiming directly at any man, but ready to fire in an instant. "The lady's under my protection now." Callahan spat on the ground. "Lady?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That half-breed?" He nodded to his companions. "Tiago, Carlo, grab her. We're not finished." "I've got papers," the woman called from behind the rocks. "And this." She'd somehow obtained a pistol, likely dropped by one of Callahan's startled men in the chaos. Before the standoff could escalate further, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats caught everyone's attention. From the east, a dust cloud approached, at least 6 riders coming hard and fast. Callahan's thin lips curled into a smile. "That'll be Sheriff Wallace. We already sent word about an illegal squatter. He'll be interested to know whose side you've chosen, Reed." Mason didn't lower his Winchester. "Then we'll let the law decide." Sheriff Jeb Wallace and 5 deputies arrived in a cloud of dust, surrounding the creek bed with practiced efficiency. Wallace was in his 50s, with a weather-beaten face and cold eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. His loyalties followed whoever lined his pockets deepest. Mason had never trusted him, but right now the law was their only hope of preventing further bloodshed. "Mason Reed," Wallace called out, feigning surprise. "Heard gunfire. You having trouble on your boundary line?" "Just ran off some men who were threatening this young woman," Mason replied carefully, gesturing toward the boulders where she remained hidden. Wallace's forced smile vanished as his gaze found the woman, who had emerged from behind the rocks with the pistol held cautiously at her side. "Woman?" His expression hardened as he took in her appearance. "Interesting choice of words, Reed." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Mason could feel the weight of every eye on him. One of Wallace's deputies, a young man with a nervous trigger finger, was already loosening his pistol in its holster. "My name is Isabel Vasquez," the woman said suddenly, stepping forward with her chin high. Despite the burns on her arm and the dirt streaking her face, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "And I have every legal right to be here." Sheriff Wallace's laugh was harsh. "Rights?" He exchanged glances with Callahan. "You better check your paperwork, girl. This is treaty land, and you're trespassing." "My papers are in order," Isabel said, reaching into a small leather pouch tied at her waist. She pulled out a folded document in the medal Mason had spotted earlier. "Congressional Medal of Honor," she said, holding up the medal for all to see. "Captain Miguel Vasquez, 1st Union Cavalry, my father." She unfolded the paper carefully. "And this is his land grant, signed by the territorial governor himself. This land is mine by right." "Your father was that Mexican officer?" Wallace asked, genuine surprise breaking through his practiced indifference. Even among Wallace's deputies there were murmurs of recognition. "Half Mexican, half Spanish," Isabel corrected, "and he died at Antietam with a Union bullet in his chest and an American flag in his hand." Her voice remained steady, but Mason caught the subtle tremor of contained rage. "He died believing this country would be different after the war. Died believing his daughter would have a place in it." One of the younger deputies shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I heard of Captain Vasquez. My brother served under him. Said he was the bravest man he'd ever seen." "Papers can be forged," Wallace said, but his voice lacked conviction in the face of the medal and the shifting mood. "The medal can't," Mason interjected quietly. Isabel's eyes remained fixed on Wallace, unflinching. "My father's courage can't be forged either, Sheriff. Neither can mine." Mason stepped closer to Isabel. "Ma'am, you're welcome to shelter at my ranch until this matter is properly sorted." He turned to Wallace. "Unless the sheriff objects to a landowner offering hospitality to a neighbor." The offer hung in the air like gun smoke. Wallace's eyes narrowed as he calculated the political implications, the potential profit or loss of various responses. "Mighty generous of you, Reed," the sheriff said finally. "I'll need to verify these papers with the land office." He turned to Callahan. "Frank, seems like we might have a misunderstanding here." Callahan wasn't ready to back down. "This isn't over, Reed," he hissed, low enough that only Mason could hear. "You always did pick the wrong side." "And yet I'm still standing," Mason replied quietly. "Think on that, Frank." As they rode toward Mason's ranch, Isabel finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Despite her words, there was no gratitude in her voice, just the wary assessment of someone who'd learned the hard way that every debt must be repaid. "I didn't do it for thanks," Mason said simply. Then after a pause, "What did Callahan mean about your father hiding money?" Isabel's expression hardened. "Just another lie. My father died with nothing but honor to his name." She glanced sideways at Mason. "Why did you really help me, Mr. Reed?" Mason considered his words carefully. "I've spent too many years watching trouble and doing nothing. Guess I finally got tired of the view." The sunset painted Mason's modest ranch in shades of gold and amber. The adobe house, barn, and corrals spoke of honest work and careful planning. It wasn't much compared to some of the larger spreads, but it was his, built with his own hands after the war. "It's not much," Mason said as they dismounted, "but it's safe for now." Isabel surveyed the property with appraising eyes. "It's almost exactly what my father described in his letters. The ranch he dreamed of building." She turned to Mason. "He never got the chance." Inside his home, Mason lit the oil lamps as evening descended. The interior was simple but comfortable, a stone fireplace along one wall, a solid wooden table and chairs, bookshelves lined with volumes on ranching, local history, and a few dog-eared novels. A gun rack holding 3 rifles stood beside the door, each weapon meticulously maintained. Above the mantel hung a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a determined mouth. Sarah Reed, whose grave lay beneath the cottonwood tree visible through the kitchen window. Beside the portrait rested Mason's old Texas Ranger badge, its silver star a reminder of the man he used to be. Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Isabel studied her reluctant host. "You were a ranger. What made you quit?" Mason's jaw tightened. "That's a story that pairs better with whiskey than coffee." "Then pour the whiskey," Isabel said, pushing her empty cup toward him. "I've earned it today." Mason raised an eyebrow but reached for a bottle on the shelf. He poured 2 fingers into each cup. "7 years ago, I led a raid on a trafficking operation," he began, his voice low. "Found 16 women and children being sold across the border. Callahan was running it." Isabel sipped the whiskey, her eyes never leaving his face. "That's when you shot him." Mason nodded. "Should have killed him. The governor's nephew got him released. Political connections." He stared into his cup. 3 months later, Callahan and his men attacked a settlement where we'd relocated some of the women. Killed 11 people. His knuckles whitened around the cup, including my partner and his family. "So you left the Rangers," Isabel said. It wasn't a question. "The badge stopped meaning what I thought it did," Mason replied. "Around the same time Sarah got sick. Fever." His eyes drifted to the portrait. "By the time she was gone, I'd had my fill of death. Hung up my gun and badge. Bought this place." Isabel was silent for a moment. "My father used to say peace isn't the absence of violence. It's the presence of justice. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Isabel said. Then unexpectedly, "Callahan murdered him." Mason's head snapped up. "What?" Isabel's eyes held the cold fire of long-nurtured vengeance. "A year ago, my father came to claim this land grant. Callahan and his men ambushed him, tortured him for information about non-existent money, then burned him alive." She took another swallow of whiskey. "The local law did nothing, said there was no evidence." "Wallace," Mason guessed. Isabel nodded. "The same. That's why I came myself, to claim what's mine and find justice for my father." Mason studied her with new eyes. This wasn't just a woman defending her property rights. This was someone on a mission as personal as it was dangerous. "That's why you recognize me, isn't it?" Mason asked. "You knew who I was before today." A ghost of a smile touched Isabel's lips. "Captain Mason Reed, the ranger who broke Callahan's smuggling ring. My father spoke highly of you." She set down her cup. "I didn't know if you'd help." Men change. Before Mason could respond, the low howl of a coyote caught his attention, except it wasn't quite right. After years on the frontier, Mason knew the difference between an animal's cry and a man's imitation. "Stay here," he said, reaching for his Winchester. On the porch, Mason scanned the darkness. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the silver-painted landscape under the rising moon. Then a flicker of movement along the tree line. Moonlight glinted off something metal, a rifle barrel perhaps. He slipped back inside, finding Isabel already holding the pistol she'd acquired earlier. "Someone's watching the house," he said quietly. "At least one man in the trees to the north." Isabel's expression didn't change. "Callahan. Likely." Mason checked his Winchester, then the Colt at his hip. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." "I can shoot," Isabel said firmly. "And I don't need charity or protection, Mr. Reed." "Mason," he corrected, "and it's not charity, it's strategy. You're no good to either of us exhausted." Isabel held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Wake me in 4 hours. I'll take the second watch." Mason prepared the spare room for Isabel, then positioned himself near the front window, rifle across his knees. As the house settled into silence, he found himself reflecting on the sudden turn his life had taken. For 5 years, he'd avoided entanglements, steering clear of other people's troubles. Now he'd placed himself squarely in the path of Frank Callahan's vengeance. Again. The attack came just before dawn. Mason, who dozed only in brief snatches throughout the night, heard them before he saw them. The soft thud of hooves on packed earth, approaching from the north side of the property where the trees provided cover. He was at the window in an instant, 6 riders with torches heading for the barn. They meant to burn him out. "Isabel," he called, already moving toward the door. She emerged fully dressed, the pistol in her hand. "Callahan?" she asked, her voice calm. Mason nodded, grabbing extra ammunition from the gun rack. "They're heading for the barn, going to try to burn us out." He handed her a shotgun from the rack. "This will serve you better than that pistol if they get close." "I know how to use it," she said, checking the weapon with practiced hands. There was no time for surprise at her familiarity with firearms. Mason positioned himself at the front window, Isabel at the back. The riders had split up, circling the property. "They're trying to surround us," Mason said, his voice steady despite the danger. "Wait for them to get closer before firing. Make each shot count." Through the pre-dawn gloom, Mason recognized Callahan leading the group heading for the barn. His distinctive slouched posture was unmistakable even in the dim light. Beside him rode another familiar figure, Deputy Carlo Velez, one of Wallace's men. The corruption ran deeper than Mason had suspected. Mason took careful aim. The Winchester was accurate at distance, and he'd kept his skills sharp hunting deer. He regulated his breathing just as he'd been trained years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. His finger found the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the pre-dawn stillness. One of the men heading for the barn pitched forward, tumbling from his saddle. The others scattered, seeking cover. "Reed!" Callahan's voice carried across the property. "We just want the woman and what belongs to us. Hand her over and we'll leave your ranch standing." Mason's answer was another shot that splintered wood near Callahan's position. From the back of the house, Isabel's shotgun roared, followed by a cry of pain. "I got one," she called, her voice tight with satisfaction. The firefight intensified. Bullets shattered glass and splintered wood as Callahan's men found positions behind the water trough and fence posts. Mason and Isabel returned fire when targets presented themselves, but they were outnumbered. "They're moving toward the house," Isabel warned as 3 men made a dash across the open ground. Mason swung his rifle toward them, dropping one with a clean shot. The other 2 reached the shelter of the porch. The front door shuddered as someone slammed against it. "Get back," Mason ordered Isabel, moving to position himself with a clear line of fire at the entrance. The door burst open. Mason fired twice, dropping the first man. The second got off a wild shot that sent splinters flying from the doorframe beside Mason's head before Isabel's shotgun caught him full in the chest, the blast hurling him backward onto the porch. "You all right?" Isabel called. "Just splinters," Mason answered, quickly reloading. Outside, Callahan was shouting orders. 2 of his men had reached the barn and were setting fire to the hay inside. Flames began to lick up the wooden walls. "Damn it," Mason muttered. The barn represented half his livelihood. The cattle would survive, but the winter feed, tools, and seed for spring planting would all be lost. A bullet shattered the window near Isabel's position, showering her with glass. She ducked but kept her grip on the shotgun. "We need to move," Mason said. "They've got us pinned, and that fire will reach the house soon enough." Isabel nodded grimly. "What's the plan?" Mason's mind raced. They couldn't stay, but running meant exposure. Then he remembered. "The root cellar," he said. "There's a tunnel Sarah and I dug when we first built this place. It comes out near the creek, about 200 yards from the house. Grab whatever ammunition you can carry." As they prepared to make their move, a new sound joined the cacophony, the rhythmic pounding of approaching hoofbeats. Many horses coming fast. "More of Callahan's men?" Isabel asked, her face taut with tension. Mason shook his head. "Too many, and coming from the wrong direction. "Reed!" Callahan shouted from outside. "This is your last chance. Send out the woman or burn with her." Mason met Isabel's gaze. "Ready." She nodded, eyes fierce with determination. "Ready." The approaching riders crested the rise just as Mason and Isabel were about to make their dash for the cellar. In the growing light of dawn, Mason recognized the lead rider, Thomas Wilson, owner of the general store in town and Mason's oldest friend in the territory. Behind Thomas rode at least a dozen men, some from town, others from neighboring ranches. They thundered onto Mason's property, rifles raised. Caught by surprise, Callahan and his remaining men scattered. Two ran for their horses, while Callahan and another man ducked behind the burning barn. "Mason," Thomas called out. "You still breathing in there?" "Still here," Mason shouted back, relief flooding through him. Thomas dismounted, his substantial frame moving with surprising agility for a man in his 60s. His wild gray beard and round spectacles gave him the look of a frontier Santa Claus, but the shotgun in his hand suggested he'd brought something other than presents. "Heard there was trouble out here," Thomas said as he reached the porch. "Thought you might need a hand." The town blacksmith, Ben Lowry, and his two sons joined Thomas at the house, while the other riders pursued Callahan's fleeing men. "How'd you know?" Mason asked, stepping onto the porch. Thomas adjusted his spectacles. "Young Billy Jenkins was in town for supplies yesterday. Overheard Wallace and Callahan planning something." His eyes found Isabel in the doorway. "This must be Captain Vasquez's daughter. Heard you were coming to claim your father's land." Isabel nodded, surprised. "You knew my father?" "Knew of him," Thomas corrected. "Any man who earns the Medal of Honor deserves to be remembered." He turned to Mason. "Wallace has been in Callahan's pocket for months. They've been running their own little empire, extorting ranchers, running off legitimate settlers, claiming abandoned properties for themselves. We need to put out that fire before we lose the whole ranch." Ben Lowry interrupted, gesturing toward the barn where flames were now consuming the entire structure. "Too late for the barn," Mason said grimly. "Let's make sure it doesn't spread to the house." As the men organized a bucket brigade from the well, Thomas pulled Mason aside. "This isn't over, Mason. Callahan escaped, and he's got Wallace behind him." "I know," Mason said, "but we've got a reprieve. Time to plan." After the fire was contained, the barn a total loss, but the house spared, Mason gathered Thomas, Ben, and Isabel around the kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through the windows as they assessed their situation. "Callahan will be back," Mason said flatly, "with Wallace and more men." "Then we prepare," Isabel said. Her face, smudged with soot and grim with determination, reminded Mason of soldiers he'd known during the war. Men who'd stared death in the face so often they'd stop flinching. Thomas nodded. "I brought supplies, ammunition, food, even some dynamite left over from when they were blasting for the railroad." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Dynamite? That's mighty convenient." "Thomas?" The older man's eyes twinkled behind his spectacles. "I've always been a believer in being prepared for any eventuality." By midday, they had a plan. Mason drew a rough map of the property on a piece of paper, marking the best defensive positions and likely approaches. "We've got good sight lines from the house," he explained, pointing to the map. "The barn's gone, but the stone foundation provides cover to the north. The creek bed offers a natural trench to the east." "What about the ridge to the west?" Ben asked. "That's where I'll be," Isabel said firmly, "with a rifle. Anyone coming over that ridge will be exposed against the sky." Mason nodded, impressed by her tactical thinking. "We'll set traps along the main approach. Trip wires connected to Thomas's dynamite. Just enough to create confusion, not enough to destroy the whole property." "What about the men who came with us?" Ben asked. "Most have gone back to town or their ranches." "Better that way," Mason said. "This isn't their fight. Besides, we need eyes in town. watching Wallace's movements. As the men dispersed to begin preparations, Mason found Isabel on the porch, cleaning the shotgun with practiced efficiency. "Where'd you learn to handle firearms like that?" he asked, genuinely curious. Isabel didn't look up from her work. "My father taught me to shoot before I could read. After he died, I spent a year with an old buffalo hunter named Jackson. Learned to use a Sharps rifle well enough to make a living supplying meat to railroad camps." Her hands moved smoothly over the weapon. "I'm not just here for my father's land, Mason. I'm here for justice." "Revenge," Mason corrected quietly. "There's a difference." Isabel's dark eyes met his. "Is there? You are a lawman. What happens to men like Callahan and Wallace in a place like this? They thrive while good people die." Mason couldn't argue with her assessment. He'd seen too much frontier justice, or the lack of it, to pretend the law always prevailed. "Just remember," he said instead, "vengeance has a cost. One I've paid before." By late afternoon, the ranch had been transformed into a fortress. Trip wires with small charges of dynamite had been set at key approaches. Firing positions had been prepared at the house and the ridge. Thomas had taken his wagon back to town to gather intelligence on Wallace's movements, leaving behind enough supplies to withstand a siege. As dusk approached, Mason found Isabel on the ridge. The Sharps rifle Thomas had brought laid out beside her. She was studying the land through field glasses, memorizing the terrain in the fading light. "Callahan will come at dawn," she said without looking up. "It's what I would do. Attack with the rising sun at my back." Mason nodded. "Likely. You should get some rest before then." Isabel lowered the glasses and turned to face him. In the golden light of sunset, with determination etched into every line of her face, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty. "Why are you really helping me, Mason?" she asked. "This isn't your fight." Mason considered his answer carefully. "Maybe I'm tired of running from fights that matter." He gazed out over the land, his ranch to the east, her claim to the west. "Or maybe I'm just making up for lost time." "Lost time?" "5 years of looking the other way," he said quietly, "watching men like Callahan and Wallace take what isn't theirs because standing up meant risking what little I had left." Isabel studied him. "And now?" "Now I remember something my father taught me," Mason said. "A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything." A hint of a smile touched Isabel's lips. "My father said something similar. El hombre que no defiende nada, no vale nada." "The man who defends nothing is worth nothing," Mason translated. The smile reached Isabel's eyes. "Your Spanish is better than I expected, Ranger." "Former Ranger," he corrected, "and you picked things up on the border." As they walked back to the house, the first stars appearing overhead, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the grim determination to simply survive another day, but a reason to fight that went beyond mere existence. Inside, they made final preparations. Weapons were cleaned and loaded. Escape routes were confirmed. Water and ammunition were placed at each defensive position. "Get some sleep," Mason told Isabel as the night deepened. "I'll take first watch." "Wake me in 4 hours," she replied, the same arrangement as the night before now, an established protocol between them. But sleep proved elusive for both. Mason found Isabel still awake when he checked the house an hour later, sitting at the table with her father's medal in her hands, rubbing her thumb over the engraved surface as if seeking guidance from the medal itself. "He would be proud," Mason said from the doorway. Isabel looked up, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Of what? That I've dragged another man into a war that already killed him?" "That you're fighting for what's right," Mason corrected. "No matter the cost." She was silent for a long moment. "What if I'm not sure anymore? What's right, I mean?" Mason entered the room, taking the chair across from her. "Justice and vengeance look similar in the moment," he said carefully. "It's the aftermath that shows the difference." "And what is that difference?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Peace," Mason said simply. "Vengeance leaves you hollow. Justice lets you rebuild." Isabel's fingers closed around the metal. "And if we die tomorrow, what then?" "Then we die knowing we stood for something," Mason replied. "There are worse epitaphs." Dawn broke over Mason Reed's ranch in streaks of crimson and gold, as if the sky itself were preparing for bloodshed. Inside the house, Mason checked his weapons one final time. The Winchester rifle, his Colt revolver, and a shotgun loaded with buckshot for close encounters. Isabel had taken her position on the ridge with the Sharps rifle, a buffalo gun capable of taking down a man at 800 yards. With her experience as a hunter, she would serve as their early warning and long-distance protection. Ben Lowry and his son James had arrived before first light to reinforce their numbers. They positioned themselves at the stone foundation of the burned-out barn, covering the northern approach. Thomas hadn't returned from town, a worrying sign. Either he'd been detained, or something had happened to prevent his return. Movement to the southwest. Isabel's voice came through the morning stillness, carrying from the ridge. "At least 15 riders." Mason moved to the window, field glasses in hand. Through them, he could make out the approaching force, Callahan and Wallace riding side by side at the head of a column of men. Some wore deputy badges, others were clearly hired guns. "Remember the plan," Mason called out to Ben and James. "Let them get close to the tripwires before engaging." The riders split into 3 groups as they approached the ranch. 6 heading toward the barn foundation, where Ben and James waited. 6 circling wide to approach the ridge where Isabel had positioned herself, and Wallace and Callahan with 3 others coming directly for the house. Mason's grip tightened on his Winchester. The quiet before battle was always the worst part. That moment of suspended time when the mind raced through all the ways things could go wrong. The first explosion ripped through the morning air as the group heading for the barn triggered one of Thomas's dynamite traps. Horses reared in panic, throwing 2 riders to the ground. Ben and James opened fire from behind the stone foundation, forcing the others to scramble for cover. "Now it begins," Mason muttered, sighting down his rifle at Wallace's group. Isabel Sharps roared from the ridge, the heavy bullet finding one of the men attempting to flank her position. He fell from his saddle, triggering a flurry of return fire that kicked up dirt around her location. Mason focused on Wallace and Callahan. The 2 men had separated, taking cover behind a water trough and a fallen log. The 3 men with them spread out, working to surround the house. Mason took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired. One of Wallace's men dropped, clutching his shoulder. The others returned fire, bullets thudding into the walls of the house and shattering another window. The battle escalated quickly. Gunfire erupted from all directions. The steady boom of Isabel Sharps, the rapid reports of Ben and James's rifles, the crack of Mason's Winchester, and the answering fire from Wallace's men. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Mason's face, forcing him to duck. When he rose again, he saw Wallace making a dash for the porch, pistol in hand. Mason pivoted, firing twice in rapid succession. The first shot missed, the second caught Wallace in the leg, sending him sprawling in the dirt halfway to the house. "Reed!" Wallace shouted, crawling behind a rain barrel for cover. "This doesn't have to end with all of us dead. Send out the woman and her father's medal, and we can all walk away." "What's so special about that medal, Wallace?" Mason called back, reloading. "What are you really after?" A laugh from Callahan answered him. "Tell him, Isabel. Tell him about the map your father hid in that medal." Mason glanced toward the ridge, but Isabel was too far away to respond, and too busy holding off the men trying to flank her position. Another explosion rocked the property as a second dynamite trap was triggered. 2 more of Wallace's men went down, caught in the blast. In the momentary confusion, Mason spotted movement from the creek bed. Thomas Wilson, crawling through the brush with a bundle strapped to his back. The old shopkeeper had circled around behind Wallace's men. Mason needed to create a distraction. He grabbed one of the dynamite sticks Thomas had left behind and quickly lit the fuse. With a powerful throw, he sent it arcing toward the space between Wallace and Callahan's positions. The explosion sent dirt and debris flying, forcing both men deeper into cover. In the chaos, Thomas reached the back of the house undetected. "Brought something special," Thomas said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a Gatling gun, an early model hand-crank machine gun. "Borrowed it from the Army depot. A friend of mine owes me a favor." Mason's eyes widened. "Thomas, you old devil." Together, they manhandled the weapon into position at the front window. "I'll cover you," Mason said. "Get it ready." On the ridge, Isabel was running low on ammunition. 3 men had worked their way up the backside of the hill and were closing in on her position. The Sharps was powerful but slow to reload. She switched to her pistol, firing carefully, making each shot count. Ben and James had eliminated most of the threat from the north, but James had taken a bullet to the arm. They were pinned down, unable to provide support to either Mason or Isabel. "Isabel's in trouble," Mason told Thomas as the older man prepared the Gatling gun. "I need to reach her." "Go," Thomas said, settling behind the weapon. "I'll give you covering fire." Mason checked his Colt, ensuring it was fully loaded, then slipped out the back door of the house. Using the smoke and confusion from the multiple gunfights, he worked his way toward the ridge, staying low and using every bit of cover available. At the base of the ridge, he heard Isabel's pistol fire twice, followed by a man's scream. Then silence. Mason's heart pounded as he scrambled up the rocky slope, expecting to find the worst. Instead, he found Isabel standing over 2 dead men, reloading her pistol with bloody hands. A third man lay a few yards away, taken down by her Sharps rifle earlier. "You're hit," Mason said, noticing the blood seeping through her sleeve. "Just a graze," Isabel replied, though her face was pale beneath the dirt in powder burns. "We have bigger problems." She pointed toward the house where Callahan had worked his way to the rear entrance. Thomas, focused on operating the Gatling gun at the front, wouldn't see the threat until it was too late. "Go," Isabel said. "I'll cover you from here." Mason nodded and began making his way back down the ridge, staying out of sight of Wallace, who was still pinned behind the rain barrel but periodically firing toward the house. The distinctive chatter of the Gatling gun erupted from the house. Thomas had begun firing, the multiple barrels spitting bullets in a continuous stream that forced Wallace's remaining men to stay firmly behind cover. Taking advantage of the distraction, Mason sprinted the final distance to the house, entering through a side window just as Callahan kicked in the back door. Thomas turned at the sound, but too late. Callahan's first shot caught the old man in the shoulder, spinning him away from the Gatling gun. His second shot would have finished Thomas if Mason hadn't fired first. Mason's bullet struck Callahan in the side, staggering him. The outlaw ducked behind the door frame, returning fire blindly. "It's over, Buck." "Frank," Mason called, moving to check on Thomas. The old man was conscious, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder, but out of the fight. "Not until I get what I came for," Callahan shouted back. "That metal has a location of Vasquez's gold shipment, worth more than this whole damn territory." "There is no gold." Isabel's voice came from the side window, the Sharps rifle in her hands aimed directly at Callahan's position. "Just a lie my father told while you were torturing him." Callahan's laugh was edged with desperation. "You expect me to believe that? Your father stole a Union Army payroll, 50,000 in gold eagles. I've spent a year tracking it down." "My father took that gold on orders," Isabel said, her voice cold, "to keep it from Confederate raiders. He delivered it to Union lines after Antietam, before he died. That's why he received the medal." Her finger tightened on the trigger. The only map in that metal is in your diseased mind, Callahan. Before Callahan could respond, the sound of approaching riders caught everyone's attention. Through the window, Mason could see a dust cloud approaching from the east. At least 20 men on horseback, moving fast. Army patrol, Thomas managed, his voice weak from pain and blood loss. Mason realized what Thomas had done. You didn't just borrow the Gatling gun, did you? You told them about Wallace and Callahan. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's pale lips. Said there was an armed insurrection. May have exaggerated a bit. Outside, Wallace had realized their predicament. Callahan, he shouted, riders coming, army by the look of it. Callahan's face contorted with rage and desperation. In a final, reckless move, he lunged into the room, firing wildly. Mason dove to the side, returning fire. 2 bullets struck Callahan in the chest, driving him backward against the wall. But the outlaw managed one last shot as he fell. The bullet missed Mason, streaking across the room toward Isabel at the window. Time seemed to slow as Mason watched in horror, unable to intervene. At the last possible moment, Isabel shifted. Whether by instinct or luck, Mason would never know. The bullet grazed her temple instead of striking true, sending her sprawling nonetheless. Isabel! Mason rushed to her side as Callahan slumped to the floor. Dead. Blood streamed from the wound on Isabel's temple, but her eyes fluttered open. Did I miss anything? She asked weakly. Relief flooded through Mason. Just the cavalry arriving fashionably late. Outside, the army patrol had surrounded the house. Wallace and his remaining men, outgunned and demoralized, surrendered without further resistance. 2 weeks later, Mason stood on his newly rebuilt porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise over his property. The barn was being reconstructed, the lumber paid for by the territorial government as compensation for damages during what was now being called the Shadow Valley incident. Thomas was recovering well, already talking about expanding his store to include a proper gunsmith shop. Ben Lowry and his sons had helped with the rebuilding, strengthening the bonds of community that Mason had neglected for too long. Sheriff Wallace and the surviving members of his corrupt department were awaiting trial in the territorial capital. Without Callahan's money and influence, Wallace had quickly implicated others in their scheme, hoping for leniency. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Mason's attention. Isabel rode up on a chestnut mare, her father's medal pinned to her shirt, a new hat shading the healing wound at her temple. In the 2 weeks since the battle, she'd begun clearing land on her father's property adjacent to Mason's ranch. Morning, she called, dismounting. Coffee's hot, Mason replied, lifting his mug in greeting. They stood side by side on the porch, watching the golden light spread across the land they had fought to defend. The army investigator confirmed it, Isabel said after a comfortable silence. My father delivered that gold as ordered. His name's been officially cleared. Mason nodded. Never doubted it. The territorial governor is coming next week to formally present me with the deed, she continued. He's also appointing a new sheriff. Any candidates in mind? Mason asked. Isabel glanced sideways at him. I might have suggested your name. Mason nearly choked on his coffee. I hung up that badge a long time ago. Maybe it's time to take it back up, Isabel suggested. This territory needs good men, Mason. Men who stand for something. Mason was silent for a long moment, considering. The idea of pinning on a badge again went against everything he'd told himself for 5 years. And yet, I'll think about it, he said finally. Isabel smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed her face. That's all I'm asking. Inside the house, mounted side by side on the wall above the fireplace, hung 3 symbols that told the story of their shared journey. Isabel's father's Medal of Honor, Mason's old Texas Ranger badge, and between them, a simple charcoal sketch Sarah had done of the ranch when they'd first built it, a vision of what peace could look like. You know, Mason said, Your father's land and mine share a boundary. Isabel raised an eyebrow. So I've noticed. Could make sense to work together, he continued. Share resources, help with the building. A partnership? Isabel asked. Mason nodded. This country's hard enough without facing it alone. Isabel considered his words, then raised her coffee mug in a toast. To new beginnings, then. Mason clinked his mug against hers. To new beginnings. As they stood there, the morning sun warming their faces, Mason realized something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a man merely surviving, but the steady hope of someone building something worthwhile. Something that might last. The West wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to rebuild. Folks, that was Gunfight at Shadow Valley, another true tale from America's wild frontier. You know, the West wasn't just about gunfights and outlaws. It was about men and women finding their place in a hard land, standing up for what's right even when it would have been easier to look the other way. Mason Reed could have minded his own business that day, but instead, he chose to make a stand. That's what built this country. Not just the fighters, but the builders. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss next week's episode, The Western Storm, where we'll follow Mason's deadly encounter with the Wells Gang. I've got a feeling you're going to want to hear how that one ends. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought about Mason's decision to help Isabel. Would you have done the same in his boots? And what would you have done with Callahan at the end? This is Jackson Steele, bringing you the true stories of the American West. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your aim true.